Welcome to something special. Welcome to TEDx. This TEDx event is part of a global conversation that takes place every day in every corner of the world. In schools, in theaters, in workplaces, even in prisons, people gather to hear the best ideas bubbling up in their communities. More than 3,000 TEDx events are held every year in 170 countries. It's a remarkable thing. TEDx events are self-organized under a license from TED, a non-profit organization devoted to discovering and sharing powerful ideas in the form of TED Talks. It's not TED itself, but your local TEDx team of volunteers that has done all the work to put on today's event, including booking all of the speakers. It's this team's ideas, dedication, and time that have made this possible. We really hope today's program sparks an exciting conversation. This is a day for curiosity and for skepticism, for inspiration and for action. The more you enter into it, the more you will take out. And now, on with the show.
Welcome to TEDx DePaul University. My name is Jim Mourey, and I am delighted to be hosting the first ever online live version of TEDx DePaul University. Today, we have 6 members of the DePaul community who are going to be sharing their talks based on this year's theme, the unexpected. As you listen to these talks, I want you to really reflect on the idea that some of life's most important lessons are often those that are unforeseen. Now, you may notice I'm by myself today. It's a little sad. Normally for TEDx events, we'd be in person, there'd be a lot of audience engagement, you can ask questions of the speakers. So what we wanted to do was to emulate that as much as possible. And when I say we, a little bit of a surprise, I'm not actually alone. There's a skeleton crew of some very hardworking people who have worked effortlessly to put this on today. And so we want to thank them. They're all wearing masks right now, they're all vaccinated, as am I, so yay science. But the reason they worked so hard the past year is to make sure you could have this opportunity today. We really want to make the event as interactive as possible. So if you're watching on Facebook Live, if you're watching on YouTube, you can put comments in the comment area, and I may even read your comments online. So think about questions you want to ask our speakers. Maybe you can share emotional reactions or ideas that come to mind as you're listening to the talks, just as we would if we were in person. Also, if you want to post on social media, we have a hashtag. It's very modern. So hashtag TEDxDPU is the way to share your post with other people who might be watching today as well. So make sure you're interactive. I'll remind you from time to time to post. And as I said, I may even comment and read some of your questions online as well, live on camera. So that said, I want to jump right into our first speaker, who is Jamal McPherson. Jamal McPherson is a graduate student at the DePaul School of Public Service. And as you listen to Jamal's talk today, I want you to reflect on your own life and think of maybe an example in which a negative experience or something bad that happened to you turned into something positive. Maybe you didn't plan for it to, but it did. Or maybe you took a negative experience and turned it into something positive. So with that said, let's start with Jamal.
I got a phone call in March of 2016 that would change my life. My mother called me at 2 o'clock in the morning, and her voice was panting as if she'd been exercising. "Mom, what's wrong? Is everything okay?" She was hysterical in her response. "They killed her. They killed her." My body was frozen from fear of who she could be talking about. And I waited what seemed like an eternity for my mother to choke over her words. "They killed my sister." Everything she said afterwards was muffled, as if I had been listening to her while being submerged underwater. My aunt, more like my sister, was dead. 23 years of precious life gone, like this. Now, we were 1 year apart and grew up under the same roof, so when she died, a piece of me died with her. I was 22 at the time, still trying to navigate this complex world we call life, and I hadn't really dealt with the traumas I've experienced as a teenager. Now, I was responsible for dealing with the death of one of the closest people to me. I don't remember crying. I was hurt, I was numb, I was confused, and I felt betrayed by God. a piece of me had been stolen away. As time went on, I noticed something different about me. My heart hardened, I was angry, and I wanted vengeance. I pretty much hated the world as it was. Now, this is the first time I'm sharing this story publicly. People on the outside never really knew what I was battling because I masked it so well. And so to the outsiders, I was a mentor, a student, a veteran, a person with an affinity for nature and life. And on the inside, I was struggling. I was hurt, I was confused, and I was paranoid. I would oftentimes find myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if I was next. My thoughts and my feelings consumed me. I fell into these deep, dark depressions and would distance myself from the world, and then I would use marijuana to pull me back in. I was a wreck, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Eventually, I slowed my mentoring efforts down to a halt and set off on a personal transformation journey. And in this journey, the unexpected happened. I got a phone call from one of my mentors, Eddie. And he asked me what I was up to. And at the time, I was a pretty big deal. Well, at least I thought I was. I was working as a corporate security officer. And this is embarrassing to say, but I really felt like a member of SEAL Team 6. But in hindsight, I was more along the lines of Paul Blart Mall Cop. Eddie doesn't know this yet, but he saved me from extreme boredom by offering me a role as a job coach. Now, the caveat to this was that I'd be working with the same nature of violence that stole my aunt from me. Working with the population at highest risk of gun violence involvement. As a job coach, we offer them cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a behavior modification tool, and also subsidized employment for job readiness training. I had the privilege to work with this population on a deeper, more intimate level. And in the words of Polo G, I turned my pain into passion and I made it happen. As I progressed in this role, I came to realize that these guys were no different than me, and they made mistakes just as we all do. But what appealed to my heart the most was the longing and desire for something different, a better situation. In fact, I'm still connected with one of my mentees today, and he gave me a phone call. Now, I get a lot of phone calls. It's like my phone is a crisis hotline or something. I don't know. But I got a phone call, and he shared his excitement with a new role he had landed. Now, for him, this meant a new opportunity to improve his conditions and also to prove that he was no longer the person he used to be. I was extremely excited, and I really felt like a proud dad. But 2 weeks later, he called me, and I heard the disappointment in his voice. He said, "Jamal, I was let go because of my background. I was unsettled because I knew him, and I knew he wasn't what that piece of paper said about him." Now, keep in mind, this is not an isolated incident. Let's fast forward to March of this year. I got a phone call. I'm joking. Enough with the calls. But I ran into a mentee I hadn't seen in years. And we caught up, and he basically said in so many words that he was tired of being on his corner. He needed another job. He needed a chance. And my heart sank to my stomach, and I felt just as helpless as he did. Now let's fast forward and also keep in our mind that this mentee and this situation is not isolated. This happens to us all the time. In fact, it made me question, what is free? Who is free? What does this concept mean? A recent study conducted by Heartland Alliance revealed that there are 1,189 collateral consequences, which are additional penalties to having a criminal record. And of these consequences, 982 of them are barriers to employment. To put it another way, they are arrested, they are charged, they are convicted, and pay their debt to society. And then upon their release, they are told to stay out of trouble and also to get a good job because they are responsible for their post-incarceral fees. Keep in mind, there are 982 laws that makes it legal for companies and corporations to discriminate against them because of their background. Now, my mentor, Quentin Williams, said it best. He said that this is the prison after the prison. I mean, the collateral consequences, that is. Now, make no mistakes, I'm not saying that people shouldn't be held accountable for the negative choices. But still, how do we expect people to thrive in a system with a foot on their neck, to prosper in a system that aims to perpetually suppress and marginalize this certain group of people? Our country needs therapy. We need healing. Now, I took trainings on behavior modification and trauma-informed care, and what I realized was that these people, my people, are not criminals. They're not thugs. They're not super predators or any of these other labels. In fact, they are creators, they are intellects, they are healers, because they help heal me by helping me understand the conditions that forces them into flight or fight. I also realized that the person who stole my aunt from me, he wasn't a murderer. In fact, I don't even think he killed her. The conditions that caused his trauma killed my aunt. Now, my time as a job coach taught me a couple of things. One, trauma suffocates the child and births tragedy. Trauma suffocates the child and births tragedy. As children, we are innocent little booger snatchers who only wants to play games, eat candy, and quite frankly, wear our clothes backwards. My son does this all the time, and it drives me crazy. But we don't identify to these societal labels until we are oriented. The very essence of our nature is love. We get trapped in these consuming socialization cycles and are taught what and how to think. And when we get older and we experience life, layers are added and the child in its nature is suffocated. 2, I've come to realize that when it's difficult for us to forgive others, it's because we haven't learned how to forgive ourselves. Let me be the first to admit I make plenty of mistakes and I've learned from them. I've freed myself from the shackles of my past, and now I'm able to forgive other people. 3, we do ourselves a disservice when we judge without having a full understanding. Remember those layers? We must peel back those layers to get at the root cause of an issue or a problem. Now, without pivoting too much, I always question how our phones, household items, and cars come with directions and instructions, but yet we don't have any direction or instructions on how to manage our intra and interpersonal relationships. When I set off on my personal transformation journey, I created a system that I'd like to share with everyone here. And this system helped heal and transform me. I call it Amadi. The name Amadi has its roots in ancient Africa, and it means free man, and for others, free woman. The A in Amadi stands for assess. We must ask ourselves, why do we have these feelings? Where did these feelings come from? What are causing them? The M in Amadi stands for meditate. We must take a step outside of ourselves, look at the world around us, and ask how our thoughts and feelings could impact the world and the people in it. And then the A is for analyze. We must analyze 3 courses of actions, the outcomes and the responses, and then determine how our thoughts and our feelings could potentially impact the people we interact with. And then the D is to decide. Decide a direction based on your courses of action that treat others with the utmost dignity and respect. Make sure you include yourself. And then the I is investigate. We must investigate how we successfully or even unsuccessfully implemented our 3 courses of action into our intra and interpersonal relationships. Keep in mind that this is an iterative process. Now, when my aunt died, I was hurt and I wanted vengeance. I knew my thoughts and my feelings were fueled by my traumas. I knew that if I approached this new situation, I could potentially bleed on other people. I knew if I brought my emotional baggage into the situation, it probably wouldn't be the best for myself or for others. So I analyzed some courses of actions and I decided on a direction. And I chose to be vulnerable. I chose to share my wounds. I chose to heal as a collective. Now, looking back and investigating, I realized that this was the best decision I've made in my life. Before I end, I'd like everybody to take Amadi. I will encourage you to take it. Reflect. Use it to engage with yourself. Use it to engage with others. And I'd like to share with you a quote by Brian Stevenson. Brian Stevenson said, "Everyone is more than the worst thing they've ever done." Everyone is more than the worst thing they've ever done. So let go so that you can grow. Thank you.
So everyone is more than the worst thing they've ever done. That's just a deep insight, Jamal. Thank you so much for that amazing talk and kicking us off today. We did have some comments on social media. So from Pauline West and Denise Hughes on Facebook, they mentioned that they were proud of Jamal. In fact, Denise said, "Thank you, Jamal, for your mentorship." And fun fact, Denise is Jamal's mother. So even as his mom, she's thanking him for his mentorship. So that's pretty powerful. He's a pretty special guy. You should be very proud. So thanks, Jamal, for getting us started. Now we're going to move on to our next speaker, who is Jacqueline Kelly McHale. And Jacqueline is a faculty member at the School of Music here at DePaul. And she is going to be taking us on a journey to understand the surprisingly racist origin of classic folk songs. So let's hear what she has to say.
Around 20 years ago, I was teaching a song. It was a song I commonly taught. The words lent themselves well to movement that the students enjoyed. And the tune, it was a catchy tune, the kind that stays with you long after you have sung and played. For most of my adult life, I have been a music teacher. I have sung songs, played games, and instructed children in how to make music, understand music, read and write music. For about 10 years, I taught at the elementary level, working mostly with kids in kindergarten through 5th grade. Like many of my colleagues, I believed in the importance of using folk songs in my classroom. I currently teach at the university level. I'm what's known as a music teacher educator, which basically means I teach students in college who want to become music teachers. My specialty is elementary general music. I share my background with you today because it's what has shaped me and defined me, and it's what has brought me to this stage. So back to that song. I was teaching the song to a group of 3rd graders when something unexpected happened. Something dawned on me. I cannot definitively say why that day, why that moment, but what I can say is that it opened my eyes and it put me on a path that I have followed ever since. The song goes like this. Da 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 dum bum ba ba da 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 dum. For some, you might recognize the tune. The words might have just popped into your head. In case you don't know what the song is, the words describe picking cotton. Yep. Jump down, turn around, pick a bale of cotton. Jump down, turn around, pick a bale a day. Now you may be wondering, in this day and age, why anyone would think that that song was appropriate. Excellent question. Never in my experience had anyone questioned whether or not it was appropriate to sing a song about picking cotton. It was a way of life. It was an occupation. It appeared in countless folk song collections, especially collections geared towards elementary general music teaching, including one by someone who I would consider a member of the U.S. royal family of folk music, Ruth Crawford Seeger. And it was also a great song for teaching kids how to read and write music. It seemed to check all the boxes. No one had challenged it. But that day I did, in a small and frankly imperceptible way. I finally heard what my students were singing. I finally saw as they were jumping down, turning around, pretending to pick cotton. I saw that this song was glorifying something that had historically been done in this country by people who were forcibly brought here, by people who were slaves. I stopped the students. I told them we were moving on to a different activity, and I never taught the song again. Fast forward to about 5 years ago. I had eliminated Pick-a-Bale from my collection, but I hadn't confronted the reality of some of my other songs. And this is when someone posted in a Facebook forum for music teachers about a different song, Jump Jim Joe. Now, Jump Jim Joe is a very popular song in early elementary music classrooms, kindergarten through 2nd grade. The words lend themselves well to movement. The tune is catchy and stays with you. And it is a great song for teaching kids how to read and write music. Sounds familiar. However, Jump Jim Joe was originally Jump Jim Crow and was a song that came out of the minstrel period in the United States. This song was actually back to probably around 1830. The song was made popular, and the character of Jim Crow was made popular by a man named Thomas Dartmouth Rice. Rice was a white man who was a carpenter, became an actor and a minstrel performer. Rice performed the character of Jim Crow in blackface. And he was quoted as saying that he designed the character in an effort to make people believe that blacks were better off in slavery and that they were inferior. So now imagine your kindergartner, a young black child, comes home from school happily singing Jump Jim Joe. But you, as the parent, you know that the song was originally Jump Jim Crow. This is exactly what happened that caused that Facebook post that I mentioned. The parent was a university professor who had just taught a class covering Jim Crow. The parent reached out to the music teacher to express their concern and to teach the teacher about the song. The music teacher turned to Facebook to get advice from other music teachers. The responses were varied. Some people said, we need to eliminate this song. There's no place for this song in our curriculum. Other teachers said, its pedagogical value far outweighs any other issue. And besides, we're not teaching the history. And yet others said, we've changed the words. What's the big deal? No harm, no foul. Now granted, Jump Jim Joe is not as explicit as Pick a Bale of Cotton, but it is just, if not more, problematic. And herein lies the problem. We can't just change the words and rationalize the song's use based on pedagogical reasons and expect people to just forget the history. We just can't do that. When I was a music teacher, my primary goal was to teach my elementary students how to read and write music, to become notationally literate. The 5 lines on the staff, the spaces, the notes, the clefs, all of that. The songs I used were chosen because I believed that folk songs could help create community and could help my students learn to become notationally literate. Now, why does this matter with regard to songs with a racist past? It matters because it helps us better understand why this issue persists. When music teachers like myself teach music through a single lens, such as to read and write music, we often forget about things that make music so vital in our society. Yes, learning those skills is important, but the history and experience behind the songs and materials we use is also very important. There are many problematic songs out there, and it is our responsibility to take the time, do the research, and determine whether or not those songs are appropriate for our classrooms and for our communities. There's a difference between canceling and holding accountable. When we look at the songs that we assume are okay because we were previously taught them, we will sometimes find that they're not, and that holds us accountable. When we look beyond the notation, when we look at the history, the politics, the culture, the society from which these songs and so many others came, we actually open up music in a much more inclusive way. So is there a place in our curricula for songs with a racist past? Yes. But should we sing, play, and dance while we're teaching these songs? No. If we choose to use these songs, we choose to use them as a tool to teach about history and experience, not as an easy way to teach notational literacy. We need to find the songs that will help us create socially just pathways to the musical experience in our classrooms. Not songs that continue to perpetuate the violence and inequity of white supremacy and systemic racism. We cannot simply change the words and ignore the past, because when we do, we are doomed to repeat it.
Wow, thanks for that eye-opening talk, Jackie. You know, as we reflect on her words, I want you all to think about your domain of expertise, whether you're a student or maybe you work in a particular industry, and ask yourself, why do we do things the way we do them, right? Why is the status quo the status quo? And oftentimes when we think about what Jackie did in the field of music, her area of expertise, sometimes we need to question procedures and make sure, especially through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that everyone has a seat at the table, that everyone is being fairly represented. I challenge you to do that in your area of expertise, in your domain. We do have a comment from social media I want to share, and this comes from Koya Paz, who is the interim dean here at the theater school at DePaul. And she says about the folk songs, what have we normalized in society? Why don't we challenge certain things? Now, the special treat here is Koya is going to be a speaker in just a few minutes, so you get a sneak peek of her awesome talk that is to come. But before we get to Koya, our next speaker is Priyanka Pujale, and Priyanka is a 2020 graduate of the College of Communications here at DePaul, and she is going to be talking about love. Ooh, light some candles. Now, some of you might be in love, which is fantastic. Some of you may have been in love and are super jaded because your ex is a horrible person, and if you need to talk, I'm here for you. But what she's going to do is an investigation, a cynical investigation of love. So as you listen to this next talk, really reflect on how you define love. Listen to Priyanka's tale, and then maybe you'll have some insight afterwards that we can talk about. Let's listen.
Almost 25 years ago in India, after meeting for the first time in a cramped living room with their families, it was decided that my parents were going to get married. My parents had an arranged marriage. I'm a product of an arranged marriage. I like to say that I grew up in libraries. I consider them my playground because I moved around a lot as a kid. Connecticut, Kentucky, India, Singapore, Arizona, Indiana, Illinois. And as I moved from country to country and state to state, I knew I'd be able to find solace in the library down the street that housed hundreds of stories for me to lose myself in. So naturally, I grew up being fed the concept of love through the countless books and movies that the local library provided me. I moved to America at a young age, therefore these were mostly American books and movies. They all kind of followed a similar format. Boy meets girl, they fall in love, they get married. This is essentially the structure of millions of love stories passed down from generation to generation. It was quite confusing for me because the love that I grew up watching as a kid didn't follow this tried and trusted format for love. Instead, the format for an arranged marriage has one deviation that significantly switches up the routine. Boy meets girl, they get married, and then they fall in love, potentially. The love that my parents demonstrated didn't match up to the definition of love that I had been fed during the formative years of life. It confused me, and I didn't understand it. This, coupled with a rough college breakup, left me confused and frustrated with the concept of love. So I decided to launch an investigation into romantic love. I began by conducting casual focus groups with my friends. I began by asking them the generic questions regarding love, such as, do you believe in love? Most would say yes. Have you ever been in love? Most would say yes. Have you ever fallen out of love? Most would say yes. And then I would pull out the wild card. Are your parents in love? Some knew right away. Yes, they would say confidently, my parents are in love. But some hesitated. Some got emotional. And some didn't even have an answer for me. After conducting my very official focus groups, I discovered a common thread among my friends' responses about their parents' relationship. The ones who hesitated or got emotional or just straight up said no also shared the same cynical views of love that I did. It's no surprise that the love demonstrated between our parents during our formative years affects us in our adult life. A study conducted by the U.S. National Library of Medicine found that the marital quality of a child's cohabiting parents has a direct link with the behavioral issues the child encounters in their lifetime. But I wanted to utilize a different perspective when analyzing my findings. I kept asking myself, do we judge our parents' relationship based on their own true, authentic formulation of love? Or do we expect them to model for us this predetermined, perfect, and polished version that society has arranged? The funny thing is, the more I conversed with my friends who had negative views of their parents' relationship, the more their initial answers changed. It was fascinating. The deeper I dove, the more they came to the conclusion that their parents really did love each other. The difference was that the love their parents demonstrated didn't match up to the definition of love that society had subconsciously shaped for them. The love industry is booming. Romance novels generate over $1 billion in sales each year, and 1 out of every 3 fiction novels is a love story. According to Business Wire, the online dating industry is worth more than $3 billion, and it's growing by the day, with new apps being developed for every niche possible. Valentine's Day is alive and well, with consumers spending a record-breaking $27 billion on the holiday in 2020. I think it's safe to say that the business of love is thriving. Let's also consider the fact that we're in the 21st century. We're in the information age, which Merriam-Webster defines as the modern age in which information has become a commodity that is quickly and widely disseminated and easily available. A study conducted by University of California found that an average American consumes about 34 gigabytes of data a day. Think about that for a second. That's an increase of about 350% over the last 3 decades. So naturally, people talk about how important it is to be media literate, to navigate all the news and information we consume through an informed perspective, to critically assess and evaluate the countless bits of information we're fed in an effort to reduce the negative byproducts of a world saturated with misinformation. I think that we should translate this concept of literacy into our emotional lives. It's time to be love literate. It's time they were critical of the millions of tiny ways that society shapes our understanding of what love is or isn't. Love is a highly monetized concept, and with that comes the commercialization and idealization of love. You may have heard that sex sells, but I think that love sells harder. What does it mean when my idea of love looks so radically different than what it looked like for my parents? I am only 1 generation removed from possibly having an arranged marriage myself. What does it mean when such a ubiquitous cultural concept like love undergoes such a striking transformation in merely 1 generation? The struggle is especially real for kids of immigrants. We grew up watching a kind of love that is so far removed from the typical fairy tale romance that we're surrounded by as kids. They say that love transcends boundaries, but does it? Why have I spent my entire life doubting my parents' love? Yes, my parents had an arranged marriage. Yes, they barely knew each other on their wedding day. And yes, the way they love each other manifests differently than what I've observed in romance novels, the movies that we all grew up watching, or the poems that exist inside Valentine's Day cards. But that doesn't make their love any less. Instead, their love exists in the sacrifice of leaving the comfort of their homeland and family to start a new life together halfway across the world. It exists in the unconditional support my mother has shown for my father's career, following him to 2 different countries in 5 different states. It exists in my father's decision to enroll my mother in phlebotomy school a year ago, therefore continuing her education that she put on pause for 20+ years for the sake of her family. And it exists in the extra cup of cha, or chai tea, that they leave out for each other every morning and evening without fail. I think that love is truly a beautiful thing, and that's coming from me, a cynic. I'm only 22 years old. I don't even think I know what love is yet. But that's the beauty of it. It is impossible for something like love to even have a singular definition. What I do know is that love is complex. I know that love is multifaceted. And I know that love is difficult. And as much as society tries to tell you, love doesn't need to look a certain way or feel a certain way. Love has many different, beautiful faces. Being love literate means understanding that love manifests itself in the most peculiar ways. You just have to watch out for it and maybe even find it in an unexpected place. Thank you.
Love literacy. Now, as somebody who researches relationships, I really like that concept, Priyanka. You're wise beyond your years. And if I can give you any insights as to love, I would encourage you to find friends, have family, or a romantic partner that loves you as much as a dog loves you when you come home from even just stepping outside for 5 minutes, right? Somebody that comes in and they're just so excited to see you that their tails are wagging, they jump all over you, and yes, maybe pee a little bit. Now, before we go on, we do have some social comments online for Priyanka, and in particular, it's the staff and faculty from the College of Communication who gave Priyanka a huge shout out saying, way to go with the celebration emoji. So they're super proud of their alum, as are we. Moving on to our next speaker, you got a bit of a preview a second ago as she commented on a previous speaker's talk. We have Koya Paz, who's the interim dean for the theater school right here at DePaul University. Now, again, to set the mood here, hopefully you kept the candles out from the talk on love, but this time what we want to do is pull the shades, turn off your lights, and light the candles as Koya reveals some insights about ghost stories. Ooh.
15 years ago, I was doing my graduate research on the lynching of Mexicans and Latin Americans in Gold Rush, California, and I was having a very hard time finding the evidence I needed to make my claim. I don't know how much you know about lynching, but they are by definition public executions that happen off the official record. These deaths aren't technically sanctioned by the state, and often towns and communities would deny they even happened, which made it harder to prove that they did. Still, even when the official record refused an act of violence, local lore often served as an alternative archive, a different way of recording history. A ghost story about someone being killed and coming back to haunt the town was an important arrow, a sign to look more deeply into the history of a place. Very often, if local legend featured a story about a ghost who had been hung or murdered or lynched and came back to haunt the town, digging through the archive, newspapers, letters, diaries would reveal that the event, or something like it, had actually happened. So the ghost story was one way that communities were holding the violent history of a place, passing down the story from generation to generation. Now, I don't know if an actual ghost was haunting any of these places, and But their history certainly was, and this is pretty much my stance on it. It doesn't matter whether or not a ghost is real. The ghost story is, and the fact that we maybe kind of sort of believe a ghost might be real is significant, and we should pay attention to it. I'm not the only one who thinks this, by the way. There is a whole field of interdisciplinary research called spectrality studies, which is proof that academics will think of anything. Still, this idea was transformative for me, and not just in my research. For most of my life, I was terrified of ghosts. I didn't even want to hear a ghost story because I didn't want to entertain the possibility that a ghost might exist. And why not? In popular culture, ghosts are portrayed as mean, vengeful, destructive forces. They're terrifying at worst and unsettling at best. Unexpected presences who show up and demand your emotional attention at any cost. We are taught to be afraid of dying and death and the dead. But when I stopped worrying about ghosts and started worrying about ghost stories, I found myself in a new relationship with the world around me. In addition to being a historian, I'm also a performance maker, and about 5 years ago, I had the great honor of working with Free Street Theater in Chicago to create a performance called 100 Hauntings. To make this performance, we asked hundreds and hundreds of Chicagoans if they'd ever encountered a ghost. We were interested in what I call ordinary ghost stories, so not the kinds of ghosts who show up in urban legends or on a city's ghost tour, but the kind of ghosts people say they've just found in the bathroom right after signing the lease on a new apartment. Following my research, we were interested in what these ghosts might tell us about Chicago's hidden history, but we were also interested in the ghost story as a form. Like no other kind of storytelling, ghost stories ask us to gather around, lean in, and thrill at the possibility that some very scary, very chilling thing actually happened, while at the same time being so sure that it didn't, right? Right? I have found that almost everyone has a ghost story. Even people who say they don't believe in ghosts usually have a story about something they're sure has a rational explanation, even if they're not quite sure what it is. And this not knowing has left them unsettled with a feeling they can't quite explain. And this is what I love about ghost stories, how so often they get right to feeling. Underneath the fun and chill of it are complex relationships with life, with death, and with each other. Whenever anyone asks me, and whenever anyone tells me a ghost story, I ask them 2 questions. First, what do you think this ghost wanted? And second, because most people are ambivalent about whether or not the ghost actually exists, I ask, what is it that you want from the ghost? The first question is pretty easy to answer. I have found that most ghosts fall into one of 3 categories, and what they all want is pretty much the same: to be acknowledged. The first type of ghost is the kind I started studying. These are the furious returned, ghosts who have met a terrible end and they want us, the living, to remember it. These are your victims of a great injustice. Murders most often, but also things like factory fires and mysterious deaths in jail. I'll give you an example. Once, in a story circle for our show 100 Hauntings, a man told us a story about going as a teenager to break into an abandoned mental hospital on the northwest side of the city. Now, we'd never heard of this mental hospital, and honestly, it sounded like any teenagers breaking into a mental hospital story you've ever heard. A wheelchair mysteriously following them, doors slamming shut, creepy laughter. But remember, these kinds of stories can be important arrows, so we followed up. And sure enough, multiple city records show that there was a poor farm and almshouse on the northwest side of the city, which later became one of the largest carceral mental hospitals in the United States. It was the kind of place where people, mostly poor people and immigrants, were locked up for decades, often against their will. It was also the kind of place where when they died, They were usually buried in the back in an unmarked grave. The Chicago Tribune reports that as many as 38,000 unmarked graves are in the back. And when the land was finally sold to developers, they had to stop one of the projects because there were as much as 3 feet of bones blocking their way. Now, this is a really significant piece of Chicago history, but I'd argue it's not well known. Most people who live here don't know anything about it, but the ghost story asks us to remember. The second kind of ghost story is probably the most common. We'll call them the leave me alone ghost. This is the kind of ghost who just wants us, the living, to get out. Usually people experience this as bad energy or a creepy, unwelcome feeling in some parts of the house, and people usually imagine that this is a former resident who's not happy that new people have moved in. What's interesting to me about this kind of ghost story is that you find it most often in appropriated spaces. Think gentrifying neighborhoods or the old built on a sacred burial ground trope. And here's where I want to remind you that it doesn't matter whether or not the ghost is real, the ghost story is. So maybe there really is a ghost who's trying to push us out, or maybe there's some part of our unconscious that's grappling with whether or not we have a right to be here, whether or not we really belong. Sure, we live here now, but should we? What happened to the people who came before? The third kind of ghost is my favorite. I'll call them are still with us. These are your beloved grandparents, a child still playing with a ball up and down a hallway, the elevator operator still showing up to work. Sometimes these ghosts are strangers to us. They're not people we used to know, but they're not bothering us or meaning us any harm. They're just kind of there. I'll give you an example. Many people believe that the building where my theater is located is haunted. I've not experienced this myself, but I can't tell you how many people have described seeing exactly half a man sitting in our lobby. He doesn't interact with us or disturb us in any way. He's just there. Sometimes, though, these ghosts are more active. I've heard many stories from people who thought their child had an imaginary friend until suddenly their child knew how to play chess or was singing songs in a totally different language. And here's where these stories get really emotional. Often people are convinced that this is some family member returned, coming to watch over them. One woman told me a story about her husband coming to visit on a day when she was so sad she didn't know what else to do but cry. Another woman told me she was sure that a faucet turning on and off in her bathroom was her sister because it was so like the pranks her sister used to play when she was alive. I love these kinds of stories because they show us how much we want to connect, not just with the living, but with the dead. Asking people for their ghost stories can be bone-chilling fun, but it also gets at really intimate questions. How do we feel about death? What are we afraid of? Who did we love so much that we want them desperately to return? How do we want to be remembered? What do we wish we could change? What and who is haunting us? Despite what horror movies and campfire tales would have us believe, most ghost stories reveal a deep longing. A longing for adventure, for meaning, for connection, for a beyond. A longing not to be forgotten, and a longing not to forget. We're living in a time that feels exceptionally hard. We're divided from one another by politics, and the reality of a global pandemic means that many of us have been away from the people and places we love most. So many of us are mourning untimely deaths, and grief is all around us. Unfortunately, I don't think we're always very good at grappling with loss or talking about death or talking about the way that our history is still living in the present. Ghost stories can be scary, but so is being vulnerable, so is any unknown. So the next time you're trying to figure out a way to connect and you're not sure what to do, let me offer this. Try asking someone for a ghost story. It's sure to start a conversation, and yeah, maybe they'll laugh at you. Maybe they'll turn it back on you. Maybe they'll tell you a story that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. Maybe they'll tell you a story that makes you cry. And maybe, if you're really lucky, they'll tell you a story that makes you wonder what else you don't know about a place, about a history, about a people, about each other, and about yourself. Don't forget to ask, what did the ghost want? And more important, what do you want from the ghost?
Thank you, Koya, for that fascinating talk. I don't know about you, but if you're sharing ghost stories online, I hope you do. Like, post some ghost stories that you know about. I will tell you that if you have time this fall, if you're in Chicago or when you return to Chicago to come back to campus, if you take a haunted tour at the Lincoln Park Zoo, it's one of the most amazing experiences in Chicago. It's not like ghost monkeys and tigers, things like this. It's actually about the history of Chicago. And I learned so much, and hearing Koya's talk made me realize just how much I learned on that tour about Chicago and its rich history. So I encourage you to do that. If you need somebody to go with you, I'm game. Text me, let me know. We'll make plans. But it is a super cool thing to do in Chicago. We also have a comment on social media. So on Facebook, Georgiana Torres Reyes says, holding and remembering is critical, so thanks for the reminder, Koya. As a believer in ghosts and ghost stories, I appreciate your analysis. So thank you very much for that comment, and Koya, great work. Now, moving on to our next speaker, we have Cindy De La Torre, who comes from DePaul's Catholic ministry. And her talk is a really elegant example of how we check in with other people we care about, and also how we check in with ourselves. So, Cindy?
How is your heart? I believe the quality of our answers is always directly correlated to the quality of our questions. I grew up in a funeral home on the north side of Chicago, and while most kids were dropped off at school in a minivan, I showed up in the passenger side of a hearse. I tried to avoid eye contact with classmates only to be called up by my dad, who would proudly turn on our big purple lights and wish us all a good day as he drove off. He thought it helped build my character. When I was 16, I learned to drive in that hearse. He would take me to cemeteries on the weekend and say, "Okay, now go around in circles. You can't kill anyone here." He had a very practical sense of humor. But one thing my mom never thought was funny was the way he failed to prepare for birthdays and anniversaries. He just wasn't the kind of person to buy you a gift and wrap it. A couple of years ago, he finally got tired of hearing the usual complaints, and he said to my mom, "One of these days, I'm gonna surprise you." Well, my father died unexpectedly on Mother's Day. I told you, very practical sense of humor. Death has taught me a lot about life, and I believe grief, for as tragic as it always is, can also be an unexpected gift. Because it levels us, it brings clarity after chaos. It urges us to ask better questions, real questions. Death is the force that cradles us all into long-distance loves between this life and the hereafter. If you could call heaven right now, who would you want to answer the phone? Whose voice are you afraid to forget? For the first time in a very long time, the whole world is grieving. In a society hell-bent on perpetuating difference, grief is the blessing of sameness. It compels us to compassion. Death has this way of exposing truth, while simultaneously softening out edges and sharpening points of view with the kind of clarity that can only come from staring down a grave. Given everything we've been living through, like plague, long overdue global racial unrest, and national terrorism here at home, I stopped asking people the most common question, "How are you?" I started asking more direct questions. My favorite one so far is, "How is your heart?" For many years now, I have been sort of mesmerized by this language of the heart. It began with a Bible verse, a pretty common one from Proverbs. "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." And to be clear, where we stand on faith doesn't really matter a whole lot to me. The Bible is not just for believers, That would be pretentious. The Bible is complicated literature, bathed in historical wisdom. Wisdom belongs to everyone. After this season, we have survived. I'm convinced we saw our hearts, and everything we did flowed from it. The broken and the beautiful, the sinister and the saintly, we saw it all like a train wreck right through our living room. Hearts are complicated and compromised, ornately in contradiction often, but we heed them because we need them. They're the tug that keeps us human. The difficult to describe dichotomy between what we know and what we feel, what we must and what we ought, the list goes on. But we draw from what we know. We lead with what we love. I myself am a Catholic, a cool Catholic. And this language of the heart is laced into my tradition. It has given shape to the way I think. I studied theology at Duke. I was trained to parse scripture, cross-examine different forms of philosophy, and argue with fervor about things most people don't get to talk about every day, like virtue ethics and eschatology, or the science of last things, of the end. And alongside that, I think because I have spent so much of my life at wakes and graveside at funerals, I tend to be a little bit serious about time. I started to ask myself, did my questions merit meaning? How does remembering the end orient a whole life? I was studying what I adore but cannot prove, because faith is funny like that. And then I read John Henry Newman. You know how when you're in that awkward getting to know you phase, people always ask, if you could have dinner with anyone in the world, living or dead, who would it be? Well, I would say Jesus, Dolly Parton, Trevor Noah, and John Henry Newman, in that order. He was a convert who spent a lifetime writing about what people believe and how we come to believe it. In other words, how we arrive at assent. He gave the world vocabulary for articulating truth claims for themselves. Literally, he wrote the book, The Grammar of Assent. But despite all Newman wrote, and he wrote a lot, nothing hits as deeply as what he chose to be his motto, a phrase he took from St. Francis de Sales. Core ad core. Heart speaks to heart. Because they do. Hearts talk. When the world opens back up again, and we begin to encounter one another, even when we no longer wear a mask, let's not simply just trade that mask for all the ones we wore before, the invisible sort. Let's commit to asking better questions and actually meaning them. As we move forward, may we live in the knowledge that time is not a renewable resource. And I hope we will be very careful about being so quick to heal and move on that we make our loss and our mourning the opposite of elegant. I believe the quality of our answers is always directly correlated to the quality of our questions. So, I'm dying to know, how is your heart?
Wow, Cindy. Thank you for that elegant exploration of how we check in with each other and how we check in with ourselves. One of my favorite greetings comes from a community in Africa where when they check in with one another, they ask, how are you? And the response is something along the lines of, I'm okay if you're okay. So if we think about Cindy's talk just now and we ask someone, how is your heart? And the response is, my heart is okay if your heart is okay, we might be able to go a long way as a society, as a community, to building a better tomorrow. So continuing on with that theme, we now have reached our last speaker, believe it or not. And our last speaker is David Wellman from the Grace School of Applied Diplomacy here at DePaul University. And David's talk today is about building bridges among disparate groups and people, which, if you've been paying attention to the headlines this week or this year, is a topic we could probably all stand here a bit more about. So with that said, I'll bring you our final speaker, David Wellman.
How many of us feel despair when we consider the degree of conflict, distrust, or even hatred among different national, racial, religious, or ethnic groups in our world today? How many of us lose hope when we consider the ecological realities we're facing and feel unable to change the direction we're headed? I know those feelings are strongest in me when I perceive myself as powerless to push back against what's unfolding. Here's the thing. I know an extraordinary group of people who are systematically confronting what we're facing, and their work are providing unexpected models that could guide us in the direction of healing our differences. I also believe that their efforts are laying the groundwork for the kind of collaboration that's going to be necessary in order to successfully engage our political and ecological futures. The people I'm talking about are the leading edge of a new type of diplomacy, led by citizen diplomats who are building bridges where others say bridge building to be impossible. Would you like to meet them? Now, I expect that when you hear the words diplomat or diplomacy, you're likely thinking of nation-state representatives, a small and elite group of foreign service officers whose work is aimed at preventing war, laying the groundwork for treaties to be signed, or promoting cooperation among nations. But I'm not talking about that group, as important as they are. I'm talking about a new generation of diplomats who come from many different walks of life and many different vocations. That's because today, diplomacy is no longer only practiced by foreign service officers. It's also practiced by community organizers and activists, business people, scientists, artists, educators, and religious leaders, among others. Diplomacy today is truly transprofessional, and it is out of this reality that a new group of diplomats have arrived, who are addressing problems traditional diplomats are unable to. Now, I know about these people because I direct a school of diplomacy, and I have had the privilege of traveling around the world to sit at the feet of a number of these people and learn from them. I'm also lucky enough to be able to count a number of them among my friends. So, let's begin with the Kenyan veterinary scientist Wangari Maathai. Dr. Maathai identified that one of the greatest problems facing her and her neighbors was deforestation, which led to an increase in poverty and social instability. In response, Dr. Maathai gathered a group of women in her local community, and they began to plant trees. Using her knowledge as a scientist and her skills as a community organizer, the women that she gathered went on to create an organization that eventually planted over 50 million trees in Kenya and inspired similar efforts across sub-Saharan Africa and beyond. And today it's known as the Greenbelt Movement. This movement has created jobs for over 30,000 women in beekeeping, forestry, and food processing, and has built lasting bridges across boundaries of religious, ethnic, and national difference. In recognition of her extraordinary accomplishments, Dr. Maathai was awarded the 2004 Nobel Peace Prize. Now, while Dr. Maathai died of cancer in 2011, her movement is very much alive and thriving. So next, I'd like you to meet, here in Chicago, Rami Nashashibi. His Inner City Muslim Action Network, Iman, has been creating what were previously believed to be improbable bridges on the south side of Chicago among Jews, Christians, Muslims, Latinx, African American, and white Chicagoans through a form of citizen diplomacy that gathers people together around providing basic human needs for the communities it serves. Iman sees the neighborhoods it works in as ecosystems in need of holistic engagement. It helps to transition formerly incarcerated individuals into new and meaningful roles through its Green Re-Entry program, which trains people to rehab abandoned buildings and turn them into affordable housing. Iman has also established a green market, a medical, dental, and mental health clinic, and an amazing arts program that serves the spiritual and cultural needs of the communities it serves. Iman works with people and in so doing strengthens them both economically and ecologically, two goals which Iman sees as absolutely linked. Now, as of late, Rami has found a wonderful way to take a break from his workload. He started a band. It's amazing. You got to check it out. So in Paris, I'd like you to meet Radia Bakouche, a young French woman who is president of Coexiste, an interconvictional group of young people, ages 15 to 35, who build bridges across boundaries of religious, racial, ethnic, and economic difference. Coexiste uses the word interconvictional to describe its mission of bringing together both people of faith and agnostics and atheists. Radia and her friends see all three of these groups as absolute equals, who all have equally valuable convictions. Now, while Coexiste was founded by a Christian and has had amazing Jewish and atheist leaders, Radia herself is a Muslim, and under her leadership, Coexiste is stronger than ever. Coexiste stands toe-to-toe with those people who seek to divide us by creating friendship networks among thousands of young people. And to date, Coexiste has facilitated the meeting of over 120,000 students across France, Belgium, and Germany. And then there is Ilya Sichrovsky, a Vienna-based Jewish activist who founded the Muslim Jewish Conference, a network of young Muslims and Jews who support each other, share tactics, and work together to inspire interconvictional work in wider and wider circles. The MJC was founded as a project to create one space for Jews and Muslims to meet each other and form friendships. Today, its members create meeting grounds for Muslim and Jewish bridge builders across 5 continents. Ilya was inspired to found the MJC in part due to the rise of the far right in Europe, whose success he saw as absolutely linked to their ability to network. Ilya, as a European Jew whose family survived the Holocaust, came to the conclusion that progressive people must out-network those who seek to divide us, and on an even grander scale. Now I'd like you to meet Muhammad Abu Bakr, who grew up in Sudan, where at the age of 14, he was documenting genocide in his country. Muhammad founded the African Middle Eastern Leadership Project, AML, a network of young millennial leaders across the Middle East and Africa who work together to reject the idea that peace and cooperation are not possible. AML trains young people to strategically advocate for democracy and to non-violently push back against those who use violence and fear to separate people. To this end, Muhammad created the AML Academy, a virtual school where teachers equip students with the tools necessary to effectively practice their civil society activism and counter sectarian violence more safely and effectively. And then finally, there is the Swede, Greta Thunberg, whose weekly climate strikes, transatlantic voyage, and the coordinated global responses that they inspired has served to highlight the power of an ecologically driven citizen diplomacy. Greta's efforts have highlighted to millions the fact that transnational bridge building is no longer the sole purview of the traditional diplomat, nor is it limited to those of voting age. Greta has accomplished what she has, not in spite of her age, or the fact that she lives with Asperger's, but precisely because of who she is. Greta's efforts have not only served to call a higher level of attention to the degradation of our planet, her efforts have also served to create highly diverse networks of people who are united in their common commitment to becoming local, regional, and transnational leaders in demanding that their governments, businesses, and fellow citizens adopt more sustainable practices and worldviews. So, what is required to become the kind of citizen diplomat Wangari, Rami, Radia, Ilya, Muhammad, or Greta have become? Here are some of the common qualities which I believe they share. And as I list them, I invite you to think about which of these you embody yourself, and which of these qualities you might be interested in working on acquiring. They all have the ability to put their feet into the shoes of others, and they all have a deep desire to try and see the world through other people's eyes. They see opportunities where others see only challenges. They see the well-being of others as directly connected to their own well-being. They have the courage to admit when they're wrong and take great joy in learning from others. They have the ability to practice mediation and negotiation. They have tremendous intellectual curiosity. They speak more than one language. They have the ability to create beautiful and neutral spaces wherein they invite people on different sides of a conflict to come together. They are active, engaged listeners who value other people's stories and value them as much as their own. They have the ability to see that winning is not getting everything they want. And they are absolutely clear about the fact that they are not objective, nor are they the sole purveyors of truth. There is one other thing that unites all of these people. They have a common spiritual practice. Their spiritual practice is being of service to others. Now, when I use the word spiritual, I'm not referring to any one particular religious tradition per se, because of course being spiritual is equally possible for a practitioner of a religion or a secular person. What I'm referring to, rather, are the sources that people draw on to find meaning and purpose in their lives, such as the way that people become authentically connected to each other and to something greater than themselves when they take action together. The act of becoming a diplomatic bridge builder is, in my estimation, one of the most profound spiritual practices that matter now. Now, perhaps as you've been listening to the stories that I've been recounting, you've come to the conclusion that the people I'm describing are somehow in possession of powers that you don't have, or that they're some kind of saints, or that they're somehow otherwise different from you and me. Well, I'm very happy to report that this is not the case at all. I know for a fact that all these people are quite human. They struggle with fear, doubt, grief, and anger, just as the rest of us do. What I do think is different about this group is that they have been personally transformed by the actions that they have taken and continue to take. And by having the privilege of working with them, I have been transformed as well. By choosing bridge building, we have found a spiritual practice that matters, not only for ourselves, but for many others. Diplomacy has the capacity to create communities of people who can effectively counter the efforts of those who are bent on preventing people from acting, speaking out, voting, or creating products or practices that serve to heal rather than harm our planet and its inhabitants. Diplomacy also has the capacity to create networks of communities whose numbers could overwhelm those who are invested in maintaining unsustainable and fear-driven practices. Diplomacy is a bridge to the world most people want to live in. It is for that reason that I want to invite you today to join what I call the Global Citizen Diplomatic Corps, to become part of building bridges alongside allies you didn't even know you had. In taking on this work, I want to challenge you to reject what you've been told is possible or impossible. I also want to invite you to abandon the popular myth that says that money and weapons are the greatest sources of power. That belief will never allow us to create the communities and networks we need to survive as a planet. The greatest source of power lies in those who choose collaboration, and who choose to inspire others to the work of bridge building and network creation, and who refuse to give in to the lie that says that we are powerless. What truly distinguishes the group of people that I've described to you today is one skill that they embody above all others. They have the capacity to channel the energy of their fear and their love and their anger into action. And in so doing, they have become what is truly unexpected. That is why I want to invite you to join us. I want to invite you to become a citizen diplomat.
Thank you, David, for that awesome talk. I love this concept of the citizen diplomat. All of us can be diplomats. And when given the choice to foster or create division, instead, we should choose to create connection and build bridges, as David suggests. We did have a comment from social media from Leslie Salyers on Facebook who said, "Thank you, David. I feel so fortunate to be your student." So David, you're clearly having an impact on our students here at DePaul. So thank you again for that. If we think of all the talks we heard here today, there is a common theme, a narrative going through that is extending beyond the unexpected. And that theme is this desire to connect with other people, right? In this past year, we were forced apart, right? We had social distancing, we had Zoom calls, and now there's this hunger, there's this desire to be connected again together, right? I know all of us here are super excited to be in person next year for TEDx DePaul University, but in the interim, we built a bridge that spanned over this strange, unusual year for all of us, just as David suggested, to make sure that we could stay together. And this desire to connect, it's Maslowian, it's a universal human need. It's what humans do. So thanks for connecting with us today. And I have to tell you, when it comes to making those connections, I got a text from my former student, James Wenzel, and we're already planning our trip for that haunted tour at the Lincoln Park Zoo. So you're welcome to join us. It'll be around October. But thank you so much again. Thank you to all of our amazing speakers. These talks were so inspirational. And we can't wait to see you next year for TEDx DePaul University. Have a great weekend.